We also talked about the concept of human dignity, which is at the core of all ethical thought. Today, we are going to be reflecting on the ethics of war and peace. Now, you've heard of the Greek civilization that preceded the Roman civilization. We know that the fiercely independent city-states of the ancient Greeks were usually consolidated by war. The name Alexander the Great was built around that time. Alexander had been a student of Aristotle. When Aristotle writes the book Nicomachean Ethics, it was written actually to guide Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great did all these contests up to the Mediterranean Sea, Port Alexander in Egypt. We also know that soon thereafter, the Romans came into control, and they also overran the entire European territory and North Africa, overrunning the Greek territories. So from the end of the 2nd century before Christ until the fall of Rome, I think up to around the 5th century, the Roman Empire was constantly at war. Those of you who watch some of these series, you must have watched Rome and the 13th Legion. They attempt to narrate some of the happenings of those days. And those of you who have watched Sparta, you know the Greek wars from a glimpse into that kind of setup. So while the early Christian church embraced pacifism, when the Nazarene carpenter told his followers, turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, and hand over the tunic, they took it literally, and they literally ran away from their persecutors. It explains why in Rome we have catacombs, as Christians always prayed in hiding. They dared not fight back. So when we had Roman persecution of Christians, the Christians went into hiding. They never fought back. But then one of the Roman emperors then became Christian. Increasingly, Christian teaching then began shifting to develop a theory of justifying war. And this must have been around 313. And the scholar in question is Augustine of Carthage. Now, St. Augustine was an African in terms of being from Carthage on this continent up there in Tunisia, Carthago. It is him who is known to have developed the theory of just war. He developed the standards for which believers who were so influential over states, over monarchies, over political leaders at that time, he developed the standards they would use in deciding whether to go to war, what to do while within law, and what could happen after war. When we're talking about ethics, we are talking about the standards that guide decision making. What do we do that is consistent with right living? What do we do that is consistent with good? The authentic pursuit of what is good and the determined avoidance of what is evil. Now, the standards that Augustine offered were built from the ancient codes of Cicero, the Roman, Plato, the Greek, but with a lot of Christian additions. So you have Roman thinking, you have Greek thinking, but also substantively Christian thinking in these principles that have been laid down from time immemorial on matters of war and peace. Now, in international relations, you know that many of our nations have been built by conquest. We know that up to date, the biggest budgets of our governments are going into the military expenditure. So the question of war remains relevant to date. And as this course shows, we are supposed to reflect on the ethics of war and peace, but you will have to do personal reading on the question of arms trade, because it is a key issue in our day and time. It would seem that when Augustine came to the front, he was able to modify, if so to say, the teaching of killing and that of love moving together, if it were intended for salvation. Not the life of the body was of supreme importance. Meaning that if you are going out to conquer heathens so that they may see the light, oh yes, then you would be justified in that sense. He said that attitudes, not actions, were the location of right and wrong, because the goal was to avoid hate. Even destruction of the body may benefit the sinner. See, when you kill a sinning body, the sinner benefits because his sinning body has been killed. So you see that a Christian community that had originally been pacifist in character, don't fight back. Return the sword, for those who live by the sword die by the sword. Walk the extra mile, turn the cheek. Now, at around the time of Augustine, the teaching is evolving to progressively add violence to the equation, to accept that you can actually kill for the good of the one you kill, that kind of reasoning. So his guidelines have been refined, they have been extrapolated, and we have expanded them into the broad cultural standards of what we call the just war. So what follows, what we are going to reflect on now, is this idea of the just war. And the just war standards are made up of two distinct but related themes. The first being jus ad bellum, jus ad bellum, or what we could say, the moral justification of going to war, the law that relates to going to law. Bellum. Bellum is war. So the law in going to war, jus ad bellum, okay, is one of the distinct themes. The second is jus in bello. These are Latin declensions. Bellum, bella, bellum. In bello is I think it is genitive. Jus in bello, the moral guidelines for conducting war. Meaning, what are the considerations before you go to war? Jus ad bellum. And what are the considerations while you are at war, when you are in war, which is jus in bello. These are the moral guidelines for the conduct in war. Now, each of these has several conditions. Jus ad bellum and jus in bello, each has several conditions. And you will find as we reflect on these questions, you can subject these to any other situation in which you have to decide whether to be aggressive or not. In normal operations, whether to be aggressive or not, you can actually apply these principles. And when you choose to aggress, the extent to which you aggress, you can apply the jus in bello principles. Now, we say that for a war to be considered just under the just war tradition, both conditions which justify resorting to war and conditions which justify conduct in a war must be met. So when we are going to judge whether that war is just or not, we look at the antecedents, what happened before people went to war, and the actions within the war. How was the war conducted? Before we can say that, well, that could be or not a just war. Now, if we are to reflect on the justifications for going to war, jus ad bellum, we have 6 distinct conditions. The first is that the cause must be just. We call that the just cause. So the first condition is just cause. The cause must be just. Aggression per se is impermissible. And a war is justly undertaken if it is responding to aggression. So when you are aggressed as a nation, when you are attacked as a nation, you would have a just cause to go to war. A use or threat of force by one state against the political sovereignty of another, the territorial integrity of another, would actually constitute aggression. And for this reason, self-defense is a valid argument that justifies going to war against the aggressor. But the principle of just cause has over the years been extended to include the defense of another state against aggression. Many of you told me in the 90s you were either babies or not yet born. We had the Gulf War. At that time, Saddam Hussein, leader of Iraq, had ordered his troops to overrun Kuwait, and the Americans sent in their troops to defend and liberate Kuwait. So over the years, just cause has been spread from not just an aggression against the USA, but now an aggression against another state would justify the going to war. Also, just cause has over the years grown to include intervention to protect potential victims of a massacre when things were happening in Rwanda, again 1994, God have mercy on me, you are aware that very close to us here, close to maybe 1,000 kilometers to the west in Rwanda, we had a situation where one ethnic group turned against another. People killed themselves. But at that time, the UN peacekeeping mission that was in Rwanda had a mandate that needed to be qualified. So the Canadian General Dallaire, who was in charge of the troops, writes to the UN Under Secretary for Africa and asks for permission to revise their mandate so that they may take over all the stadia that was available in Kigali, Butare, and elsewhere, Kabwe, for the purposes of allowing people who were running away from attackers to come into the stadia and be protected. But for some reason, the UN Under Secretary at that time and his team were debating whether or not what was going on in Rwanda was a genocide or not. And by the time they would come to any substantive conclusion, 100 days had gone by and hundreds of thousands of people had been killed. So this exercise of intervening and going to war in the defense of victims of a massacre didn't come into play for the UN at that time. And it is partly because a few months earlier, American troops that had intervened in the Somalia situation had been humiliated by killing them and dragging them on the streets of Somalia, okay, of Mogadishu. I think these were the Siad Barre troops, okay? So it might explain a little bit that a member of the Security Council, one of the veto members of the Security Council, had their troops suffering humiliation a few months earlier, and now it would be a question of whether they would be readily available to enter into another situation on the African continent. Finally, just cause has been stretched to include interventions that assist secessionists, okay? Meaning if a country wants to secede, there is a just cause based on the principle of self-determination, okay? So when South Sudan was always at war with Khartoum, those who provided ammunition and training to South Sudan were having their conscience cleared by the fact that it was a just war, and if these people want to secede, they ought to be supported. Finally, just cause could include preemptive strikes against potential aggressors. The second condition before we justify going to war is that a right authority must make the decision to go to war. The decision to go to war must be made by a right authority. So the second ingredient is right authority. And this would mean legitimate decision makers within government. In various jurisdictions, it could be the head of state, it could be the ruler, it could be the monarch, it could be parliament, etc. Again, this concept of right authority has evolved over the years, and it has increasingly shifted from resting on the shoulders of a single individual to a collective will of the peoples who are directly affected by what we would call the benefits and burdens of the war in question. So you would hear those who've been fighting revolutionary wars, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Savimbi, all these guys fighting revolutionary wars would be appealing to defense against exploitation and aggression, and by claims to rights of self-rule and self-determination, as well as to the right to security and freedom. You need to thank God most of you have come into the world in the post-Cold War era. The wars during the Cold War were many across the globe. These wars seem to have reduced quite a bit, but they got a little bit more focused, more incisive, more ethnic, and more civil. By civil, we mean internal in character and rarely external. But true, those who took decisions to go to war would claim to be justified by defending themselves from exploitation, discrimination, and undermining of self-rule. In our region alone, you'd have Uganda, for instance, that had close to 8 coups, I think. They had a coup in 1966, they had a coup in 1971, a coup in 1979, 2 coups in 79, a coup in 1980, a coup in 1985, and a coup in 1986. So Uganda alone had 7 coups in a space of 50 years, 62 to 2000, that is close to 50, 50 how many years now? 62 to 2000 to 2022 would be 60 years, isn't it? So they have had several coups. The current regime itself has been resisted by up to 27 rebel groups. The most popular one is the Lord's Resistance Army that was led by Joseph Kony and pushed into the Sudan and the Central African Republic. But the LRA is just one of those rebel groups that have resisted the NRA regime of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. And these resistance groups, in their multitude, have either been coerced out of rebel activity, or they have been bought and negotiated out of rebel activity. So the question here would be whether by declaring war, these rebel groups can be considered as right authority in the proper sense of the word. The next condition in the decision to go to war is right intention. The only right intention for a just war is the will to right the wrong of aggression and to bring about peace. The only right intention for just war is the will to right the wrong of aggression and to bring about peace. It is never right intention to go to war for the sake of revenge, for the sake of domination, for the sake of harm, for the sake of cruelty, or any other kind of personal or national self-interest. That can never be a right intention. But if you're proceeding to war to right the wrong of aggression, if you are proceeding to war to bring about peace, then you can claim that you have the right intention and therefore justified to go to war. The fourth condition under jus ad bellum, under the principles to going to war, is last resort. Okay, meaning the decision to go to war must be taken as a last resort. All avenues of righting the wrong of aggression must have been exhausted before the decision to go to war is taken. We need to take note of the fact that the just war tradition presumes that war is morally hated, that war is morally abhorred. And this just war tradition insists that war must be avoided as much as possible. That's why the requirement would be that if you are to go to war, the decision to go to war must be taken as a decision of last resort. You don't just go to war because the leader has been angered. The fifth condition in jus ad bellum is that the goal of the war must be a likely emergent peace. So remember, you've tried all the avenues of stopping the war, of resolving the aggression situation without going to war. And it turns out that actually you're not making any headway. But you're convinced that if we go to war, we will bring about peace. Remember, we excluded anger, we excluded cruelty, we excluded revenge, we excluded domination from the right intention. So assuming you have the right intention of righting the wrong, then you must be certain that our going to war is going to bring emergent peace. The just war tradition requires that war be undertaken only if it is likely to generate conditions of lasting peace. Only if it is likely to generate conditions of lasting peace. And such conditions would have to set right the problems that provoked the aggression, which broke the peace. Okay? So you don't go, and it will be reflected also in use in bello. The manner in which you fight the war could undermine the reasons for why you went to war. So when you're taking the decision to go to war, the peaceful outcome of the war must be a core consideration before you go to war. The final condition is what we call proportionality. And proportionality is a principle that is pervasive in many ethical decision-making situations. In proportionality, we say that war is taken up justly only where the total good to come from the war is likely to outweigh the total evil of making war. When you weigh against the aggression you're going to do, the fighting, the destruction, the loss of life, the loss of property, destruction of infrastructure, and then you weigh it against the emergent peace that you have in mind, they must be proportional. I mean, it must be worth it. It must be worth it for you to decide to go to war. If the price of the projected war is too great in terms of the total dislocation of the populations, the suffering, the death, including all human, economic, and cultural costs, as compared to the likely good that would come out of the war, and again, considering all the likely gains from the war, then such a war would be disproportionate and therefore unjust. So leaders placed at any decision-making table on whether to go to war or not to go to war have these 6 conditions to consider. It is not a simple matter of just measuring a proposed war against a given formula. Many factors must be considered, and there is usually room for disagreement and difference in interpretation along the way. Now, if the decision makers come to an agreement, to justify, for example, going to war, then attention must be drawn to the conditions guiding conduct to war. Okay, we've now agreed we have the 6 conditions in place. We have decided we are going to war. But before you decide again, you must decide how you're going to fight the war. You must think about jus in bello. Now, before I proceed to jus in bello, I'd like to take any questions with regard to the conditions relating to going to war. Do we have any comments, any questions, any clarifications, or affirmations? Hakuna? Okay, type in the chat room and tell me you don't have any questions. then I can proceed, good people. Nanyamanzia hivyo, it's like I'm talking to myself. Someone just came in. Sasa, no one is typing in the chat room. Shall we proceed? Okay. All right. So we move to use in bello. Someone's mic is echoing. So when we talk of use in bello, we are talking about the moral guidelines for conduct in war. And these have three parts. These guidelines have three parts. One is discrimination or immunity of innocence. Discrimination or immunity of innocence, which is dependent on two: the principle of double effect. Okay, principle of double effect, which is also known as the intended results as distinct from those that are unintended. And three is proportionality again, but use in bello, proportionality regards specific acts within war rather than the overall proportionality of the war. So we had six conditions relating to use ad bellum. Whitney, you keep jumping in and out. What is the challenge? Okay, we had 6 conditions relating to use ad bellum: just cause, a right authority, right intention, last resort, emergent peace, proportionality. When we come to use in bello, we have discrimination, double effect, and proportionality. Now, by discrimination, the principle of discrimination in use in bello means that in just war, non-combatants should be immune from attack. Non-combatants should be immune from attack. It is always wrong to kill. Hello? It is always wrong to kill innocents, and participants in just war must discriminate between legitimate and illegitimate targets of the acts of war. When you are to drop bombs, when you are to send rockets, when you are to direct fire at the participant in a just war, must be discriminatory in thinking to know where to direct fire and where not to direct fire. Now, this notion of non-combatant immunity has its origin not in moral sensitivity, but in the code of chivalry from the Middle Ages. Knights were usually professional soldiers, and there was never any glory in fighting someone who is not a knight. Peasants, serfs, craftspersons, and merchants were sources of wealth to the knightly class. So going to war with them didn't make sense. Actually, it was considered cowardly to attack a knight by attacking his peasants or servants or workers. You would only claim to be brave if you are able to take on the knight himself. Good people, someone is calling. Allow me to take this call. Okay. So we were talking about use in bello, and we were making a point on discrimination. Now, in our day and time, with regard to this question of discrimination, it will be foolhardy for combatants to target children, the elderly, the sick, and several other inappropriate targets of military action. So non-combatant immunity is not as easy as it may seem, because sometimes, especially guerrilla war fighters, choose to hide among the civilian populations and non-combatants for them to strike attacks. Yoweri Kaguta Museveni literally recruited children. They used to call them kadogos to fight the war. And then they blamed Konyi also for recruiting children for that purpose. Okay, so it's not as easy as it seems. Defense plant workers are usually considered legitimate targets, meaning if someone works on a military facility that produces arms and ammunition, even though they are civilian, they would be considered legitimate targets since they are working for the war effort. In the ideal circumstance, residential dwellings of civilians and ordinary people with their families would have enjoyed immunity. But modern warfare has reached into neighborhoods of traditionally immune non-combatants on the grounds that they support the war. It happens. Kenya has been blessed by never having had to go to war, whether civil or otherwise, in terms of within the boundaries. What we've had are skirmishes, massacres here and there, but not war in the real sense of the terms. But Rwandans, Burundians, and Ugandans, Congolese will tell you it is a nasty experience. Just the suspicion that in your village or your sub-county or your ward, there exists a rebel or a belligerent of any sort, an entire community could be ransacked and targeted just for the suspicion that they could be hosting the belligerents. So the second principle which supports discrimination is the principle of double effect. Again, as I told you in the previous class, we cannot separate Christianity from international relations. So even this principle of double effect as it relates to war was developed by Christians in the Middle Ages to come to grips with the inevitable spillage of war. You remember we said that sometimes war might spill into the territory of non-combatants. Sometimes the adverse effects of war can affect those who were previously not meant to be targeted. The basic argument contained in this notion is that while the injury of death of innocents or non-combatants is always wrong, either it may be excused if it was not intended to be the result of the given act of war. The point is that acts of war may have more than one effect. The intended effect is the injury or death of a legitimate military target. Okay? I want to injure, to maim, or kill a combatant. Second effect is the unintended injury or death of the innocent person or non-combatant for whom it is always wrong to target. Okay? Hence the principle of double effect. I'll have to repeat this principle of double effect. The principle of double effect comes into a situation where a good or legitimate act results into two effects, one good and the other evil, one acceptable and the other unacceptable. So then you would employ the principle of double effect. As long as acts of war do not target and thus intend the injury and death of innocents, they may be excused as unintended or collateral losses. Did you hear that? We have done an act of war, purposely intended to target a military person or military structure or combatants. But in the process, it has targeted or ended up killing, maiming, or injuring a non-combatant or an innocent. The principle is saying that as long as the acts of war do not target and therefore do not intend the injury and death of the innocents, they may be excused as unintended or collateral losses. Now, I'd like to share with you a little more on what this principle of double effect means in Christian purposes. Since we said that these principles of jus in bello were developed in Christian times. Okay. Now we need to take note, and I will restate, that the principle of double effect only comes into play when a good act, okay, a morally good act has two effects, one evil and the other good. It is in these situations that the principle of double effect comes into play. So assuming that we have a woman with a cancerous uterus, and she is carrying a baby. If we let her carry the baby to term, either she will die or the baby will die, or both would die. When you are a doctor, aware that you need to carry out an operation, which operation would be necessary to save the life of the mother, but well aware that the baby will die, would you take that decision? Would you take that decision to carry out any action which we know will cause the death of a child? Now, this is the principle of double effect in Christian terms. It states that the decision to carry out an action which, as a consequence, has unintended bad results may be made, meaning the decision may be made only when the good effect cannot be reasonably brought about in any other way, and when certain conditions have been met. Okay? You are about to do something, you know whatever you're going to do can result in something good or something evil. The principle in Christian thought is that you can never do something well knowing it is going to result in evil. So you can only do something which has both good and evil consequences if that's the only way to the good consequences. And if the following conditions are met. One, the action you're doing itself must be good. Now, I keep using this abortion explanation because abortion is intrinsically evil. but many who do it would like to say that we are saving the life of the mother. Many who do it would like to do it arguing we are saving the mother from the consequences of rape, from the consequences of incest. Okay? So the action itself must be good if we are going to apply the principle of double effect. The basis upon which we say that because abortion is intrinsically evil, it can never be a means to an end. Never do evil so that good might result. 2, the agent must have the right intention. The actor, the one who is carrying out the act, must have the right intention. And 3, the good action must be the means to the good effect. Okay? What you do to solve a situation of this mother with a cancerous uterus, that specific action must be the means to the good effect. Remember that you're trying to see 2 effects. One is good, the other is evil. The action that you do must be the direct source of the good effect. And finally, the good effect must be proportional to the evil effect. And this proportionality in Christian terms says that the good effect of the action taken must at least equal to or ideally outweigh the evil effect. In other words, when there is a foreseeable evil effect of an action, there must be a proportionately greater good effect for that action to be considered moral. The same principles apply in the situation of just war. The principle of proportionality immediately after double effect. For purposes of war, in war, the actions you're going to carry out in war use in bello, proportionality would take into consideration that the conduct of a just war is guided by proportionality. Just like in the justification of going to war, proportionality would write on the issue that results to be gained by war must be superiorly beneficial. And rather than consider the total good and evil in the balance of going to war, with regard to use in bello, the consideration is with a given act, a particular campaign, a specific event contemplated as a part of the overall war. If I choose to go and move all the homesteads from where they are and pile them in a camp as we carry out our military campaign, is the dislocation of these people and the good therefrom proportionately superior, okay, to the evil they would have faced if they didn't live? According to proportionality, each act in war must meet the proportionality test. Is it likely that the evil of doing a given act will be offset by the likely good to be gained from the act? If not, the act is disproportional and therefore prohibited. Someone comes to your house and you have the opportunity to know that they are attacking you or burglaring you with sticks. And then you respond with a firearm. You would have killed. Your response would be disproportionate. So you then realize that the elements in totality justifying going to war and the conduct in war would fit together. A war is only just if all, that is, jus ad bellum and jus in bello, are met. But the war cannot be fought under the guidelines of the jus in bello conditions. Then the war is not just and thus should not be undertaken. The same can also be said about wars that can be justly fought but fail to meet standards to justify going to war. The just war tradition is a complex, subtle, living set of standards. The just war tradition is a complex, subtle, living set of standards that has evolved for thousands of years and continue to evolve as wars present themselves for moral consideration. You are aware that today a number of military manufacturing entities are insisting on precision and reducing the human cost of war. Okay. The drones that are targeted at precisely taking out the target with limited collateral damage. Drones that are not manned by human beings, operated remotely, just like the kids play games on PlayStation. Okay, a number of these kind of innovations in war designed to reduce the human target. But we also know that a number of arms development processes include arms and ammunitions that are non-conventional. Not just firepower, we have chemical weapons now, we have biological weapons, all of them being placed into the equation. And that would have led us to the situation of arms trade and arms control. So for now, we are done with the just war theory and the ethics that would guide decisions to go to war globally and otherwise. Do you have any questions? The jus post bellum is the reconstruction efforts after the war in which the aggressor, especially when it is an intervention from aggression, would help. The global community usually has to help in the reconstruction of a post-war community. The principle of use post bellum are still under development, but there are known practices of what should be happening. The counseling and rehabilitation of victims and former combatants, documentation of previous abuses through memorialization, disarmament, reintegration of combatants, economic stimuli for the victims of the war, and a general reconstruction of law and order in the formerly combatant regions. Do we have any questions? Was the US attack against Hiroshima and Nagasaki just? Venus asks, from what we have heard, what do you think? Does anyone have an answer for Venus? She has asked, was the US attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki a just attack? Did they have a just cause? None of you is able to speak. I see your microphone's on. What's up? Canel, would you like to respond to Venus? Or Owen, would you like to respond? Okay, Owen says it was just by proportionally, it was unjust on grounds of proportionality. It was just on which grounds? It failed on the proportionality test. On what test did they pass? It passed the just cause. So the Americans are the just cause. Owen, please explain. Owen has responded to Venus and says it was just, but the proportionality was unjust. The principle of contradiction. Can something be just and unjust at the same time? Joy Karimi, would you like to provide an input on this? Sila, where are you? Whitney, you there? Diana Wangai, say something. Deborah. Brenda Wangeshi, say something. Venus is asking, was the US attack against Hiroshima and Nagasaki just? Owen says, well, it was just, but the proportionality was unjust. And I'm raising a flag there on the principle of contradiction. How can something be just and unjust at the same time? So tell us, in which ways was it just, Owen? Dalaso, would you like to say something? Esther, would you like to say something? Just from what we've discussed, Sila is saying it was just in that it made a quick end to the war with Japan. Oh my, okay. So if the war had gone on, more casualties, is that what you're thinking? And therefore, let's just bombard these Japanese. Now remember, what was the intention of the Americans in bombarding Hiroshima and Nagasaki? What is the intention? This question can be dealt with at the level of the intention, and yes, at the level of proportionality, to be able to judge whether it was just or unjust. Because they were all in a situation of where you can say, okay, everyone had just cause to defend himself. But what the US did was to aggress. Okay, so what was the intention? Talasso says it was not just because it caused the killing of the innocents along with the militants, okay? So Talasso uses the proportionality argument. Okay. All right. So, any other contribution? Okay. Whitney, Deborah, Brenda, anything you have to say? Okay. Now we've been in session for an hour and a half. I'd like us to end here, asking you to consider reading the article that I posted on the platform relating to arms trade. It will form the first part of our discussion in the next class. Okay? Do you have any questions for me? Were you able to access the recording for the previous class? Just do me a yes in the chat room and I will know. Okay. All right. Okay. So we know that we've been able to access the previous recordings. From the ground we've covered so far, are we learning or we are still struggling? Anything you'd like us to do differently? Okay. I'd like to presume that in the face of silence, we could think that we are okay. I'll keep quiet for 2-3 minutes for anyone to post anything, and then we will consider our class done. Thank you for turning up. We had 13 of you in session today. But I'm a little bit concerned that we are up to 33 on the WhatsApp group, but we've never had a class of more than 13. How do we proceed? Yes, the Trump question. Please remind me, Owen. Hey, you refuse to answer it amongst yourselves, eh? You still want me to answer that question. So reframe the question, please. I see if I can answer. Owen is saying that I was supposed to answer the Trump question. Owen, retype that question, please. I don't remember what it was actually, but I'm sure why I avoided it. Okay, why Trump is pulling out of international organizations and commitments. Yes. Okay, I will do an attempt. I'll do an attempt to respond to that question. It is at the 3 levels of analysis in IR. It is at the idiosyncratic level, Trump himself, Trump the man and his idiosyncrasies. It is also at the systemic level, meaning the political system in which he operates in the United States. And it is also at the international system level of the dynamics in the international system. First and foremost, what looks like Trump pulling out of international organizations and commitments is not a Trump thing. The US has always been a prodigal child, if I would say, of the international system. Just check the number of international human rights agreements that the US has ratified, and you will be surprised how few they are. You know that the US, a veto power in the Security Council, pushes nations to send each other to the International Criminal Court, but the US is not a signatory of the ICC Rome Statute. Okay, so US as a state, US as a nation has a tendency to exclude itself from many of these international commitments. But that doesn't mean they don't support those commitments if those commitments fit within the interests of the American people or of the American states. So, for example, there could be a commitment to sign the Rome Statute. And I actually don't commit to the Rome Statute. But the Rome Statute requires that member states shall make contributions to the court in The Hague. And the US, without signing and ratifying the Rome Statute, goes ahead and makes contributions to the running of the Rome, the Hague, the court, the International Criminal Court, and makes contributions to run the expenses there that it has not ratified, meaning it wouldn't like to be held to account under that treaty, meaning it wouldn't like any of its leaders to be brought before the ICC because we are not members of the ICC, so we won't be brought there. But yes, we seem to like what ICC does. It helps us keep in check some of the leaders across the globe that we would like to keep in check. So yes, we will support what the ICC does if it is helping us meet our interests across the globe. Such has been the behavior of the US all along. Now, recently, there's been a threat to pull out of the World Health Organization. It pulled out of the UNFPA arrangement some years ago. It is all connected at the internal US system. When Democrats are in power, there are several international organizations that will receive a flood of funding. When Republicans are in power, there are several international organizations that will not receive funding. So this is also something that is systemic. As we will be discussing in the ethics of population control, something will keep popping up, the Mexico City policy, which was instituted by Ronald Reagan in the early 80s, being a Republican and influenced by these values that are radically pro-life and would resist the sending of Americans' taxpayers' money to any organization that is actively promoting abortion. The US would not send their money out when Republicans are in power. Many of the Republican presidents, as soon as they are sworn in, within 72 hours, they would reinstate the Mexico City policy. And when Democrats are in power, within 72 hours of being sworn in, they would ban or clamp down the Mexico City policy. A lot of this explains why a number of these pro-abortion groups, UNFPA, IPAS, IPPF, Marie Stopes, Center for Reproductive Rights, FIDA, many of these organizations that you guys are familiar with had a lot of funding during the Obama administration. And because the Secretary of State, Hillary Rodham Clinton at that time, is very pro-choice in character, would comfortably make these monies available. Now, when the Republicans came to power, Christians, whether evangelical, Pentecostal, Episcopalian, or Catholic, rallied behind Trump. And that's why the numbers on CNN and whatever seemed to have failed to predict this election. And people who ordinarily never voted came out to vote. And in the process, Trump got to take the seat. Now, we may not be sure whether Trump is radically or conservatively Christian, meaning at the idiosyncratic level, but Trump seems to understand that he will only keep into international arrangements that are favorable to the American people. His reasoning is make America great again. Of course, that could be vulgarized by those who think or who would say that making America great again is to make white supremacy up again. But the point is, if we have been sending monies to the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization has been dilly-dallying with China, who is our competitor in trade, supporting their approach and their hiding of certain facts from us, and that the hiding of those facts has had an impact on the number of deaths in our country, should we continue supporting WHO? If our policy back at home is to make sure US resources are not spent on the promotion of abortion and contraception amongst minors, should we give money to WHO? Of whose purpose, one of the purposes of WHO is to promote the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda. So these are the questions that keep popping up at every moment when the advisors of Trump are in session, when he is thinking about those who voted him in and what would they like and what is good for America. I don't know if I've responded to your question. Your question was, why is Trump pulling out of international organizations and commitments? So, Owen, that's what I could say for the moment, but it takes a little bit wider studying. There's a book that I'll post on the platform of a former official in Trump's government. He published a book, they call it The Room Where It Happened. Of course, it is adverse on Trump, the person, but it can help you look at some of the idiosyncrasies there. Okay. Okay. Owen. Okay, so the question has been answered. Good. Now, I was asking you, good people, we happen to pop up only 13 of us on the group. I mean, on the lecture. But on the group, we are 33 on the WhatsApp group. And I think a little more on the Odell platform. Who knows who? Why aren't people with us? Let's talk about that. I need to hear. Does anyone know someone who is not with us in the classroom, but who should be with us? Because you're 13, you're 12 here right now. I don't know who has gone away. If each of you had a friend who is not here, and you know why they're not here, you would advise and we find out what is going on. Because people are missing out a lot. Okay, I want to presume that none of you knows what is going on with the others. So we'll have to find out a different way of looking for our colleagues who are not able to join us. So thank you for listening in. We will end our class here, and let's meet again next week.